Okay. Hello again. My name is Tim Wachtman. I'm from Plantscapes of New England, which is a not-for-profit social business. Plantscapes works on ecological restoration, and we help people with the design, installation, and maintenance of native landscapes. I invite you all to explore the Plantscapes website. It's located at plantscapesne.com. If you scroll to the bottom of the page, there's a link for tips, which has a lot of the information or reinforces a lot of the information that I'll be presenting tonight. And it also branches out from there to provide a lot of supplementary information. So I encourage you to explore on the website, and also at the bottom of the homepage is a link to the presentation notes, which I will keep up for probably a week or two. So feel free to review those or download them if you want to. All right, so in the last segment of this series, I talked about the motivations, some of the motivations for putting more native plants into our landscapes. And from my standpoint, the most important is the ecological function and supporting and enhancing biodiversity, or what I like to call the life with a capital L. And I also mentioned some other motivations, which include working in a landscape like this requires much fewer inputs, like mowing and watering and fertilizing. It's also a lot less work because there's a lot less replanting and mulching involved, mowing. And very importantly, I think, a rich habitat like this forest edge meadow, which is pictured in the background, to my mind has a much higher level of interest and interaction than this traditional suburban landscape, which in my view is kind of sterile and boring. Another thing that I mentioned was that everyone has a role in creating a more ecologically beneficial landscape. Whether you have several acres where you could put in a very diverse and rich environment like this, or whether you're living in a urban area where you might have a much smaller plot, maybe even a pocket forest or a pocket meadow, or even if you're living in an apartment or a condominium, if you have a balcony or patio, there are lots of native plants that you can plug into a container and at least support the pollinators in your area with nectar and pollen. I just want to emphasize that every contribution counts. Pollinators are having a lot of difficulty out there now, so every little thing that we can do is important to them. And moving toward more ecologically beneficial landscapes helps us all create a more sustainable, thriving planet, which is something I think we all care about. So in the last talk, I talked about biodiversity in general terms. In this talk, I'm going to focus down much more on the concerns of pollinators. And I'll begin by talking about some of the motivations for focusing and thinking more deeply about pollinators. One of the things that we tend to take for granted is our food supply. It's not something that we tend to think about on a daily basis. We go into the grocery stores once a week, and we have a wide selection of foods there that are available to us. And we often don't think very deeply about where those come from. But something around 85% of flowering plants require pollinators for pollination and to set their seeds. And in terms of our food crops, the vast majority of them need pollinators to produce those nuts and fruits that show up on our grocery store shelves. So if we're not supporting our pollinators, they're not going to be able to support us and our food production needs. Another element that's very important is in sustaining biodiversity. And the point I'd like to make here is that our native plants and pollinators have co-evolved with each other. And there's an important dynamic that we need to understand, that if pollinator populations decline, which they're doing right now in a very serious manner, the pollinators are not able to visit the native plants and pollinate them so that the native plants are able to produce a good seed set and propagate themselves into the future. If the native plants aren't propagating themselves, then they're not supporting the native pollinators, and we end up getting into a downward spiral that eventually leads to the extinction of some species. And because our own food supply is very intimately tied up with that, we have a stake in making sure that we're sustaining that biodiversity. And finally, a landscape that's supporting pollinators has a lot of aesthetic value. And to me, it goes beyond just putting pretty flowers in our neighborhood. It's all the things that those flowers attract in, all the butterflies and bees and the birds that are reliant on those insects for their food source. All those things create a lot of dynamic interest in the landscape that's often not at all present in a traditional landscape. Okay, so pollinators are a big part of the biodiversity issue right now. And some of the important things that are threats to pollinators that we need to think about are things like habitat destruction. And on that issue, we need to think about things like sprawling development and the conversion of wild areas to agricultural production, which is often to supply ever more meat to the human population, and also the encroachment of invasive species on native habitats, which are all counterproductive in terms of supporting our pollinators. Another very critical piece here is the overuse of pesticides. And this is something I'll talk in a little more detail about later in the talk. And finally, climate change is a huge issue. It's becoming ever more challenging for a lot of living things to adapt rapidly enough to their changing environment. And they're having a hard time keeping up with the level of change that we're seeing right now. Consequences of the decline in the pollinators are going to be food insecurity, which I've talked about, the inevitable loss of plants and insects, which are the very foundation of our ecosystems. If we lose our native plants and insects, that has a downstream impact on birds and amphibians, turtles, higher mammals, and ultimately it's going to affect the human population as well. And most immediately, just the enjoyment that we get from having natural things in our environment. So it's a big part of our well-being as well right now. So how do we help our native pollinators and enrich our own lives in the process? Next, I'm going to introduce you to some of the many types of pollinators that are in native ecosystems. And many of these you may not have seen in a traditional landscape because there just aren't the plants there to support their life cycles. A couple that I'll kind of talk about and set to the side to begin with are the honeybee and the hummingbird. The honeybee is actually an introduced species. So the European migrants brought them along when they came to this country for agricultural purposes. The honeybee has a lot of agricultural importance, but in terms of native ecosystems, they don't play a big part in those ecosystems because they are a fairly recently introduced species. Hummingbirds are one of the really interesting things you can attract to your landscape. And there are many native plants like this cardinal lobelia that will be attractive to hummingbirds and provide them with resources. There are many other ones as well that you can think about bringing in for the hummingbirds. Hummingbirds, however wonderful they are not really big pollinators in the northern temperate landscape. They do most of their pollinating in the tropical regions. So I'm not going to talk about honeybees or hummingbirds too much for the remainder of this talk. I'm going to focus more on the native pollinators that have a big role in our local ecosystem. So this book, Pollinators of Native Plants by Heather Holm, is a wonderful resource. Most of the things that I'm going to talk about in the next few slides are in this book and in much greater detail. This book is much more than a field guide. Heather does a wonderful job of talking about the life cycle of the various pollinators, how they interact with native plants. And she does a very nice job of talking about how to design a pollinator garden and what sort of plants are appropriate to put into different scenarios. And I'll give some examples of doing that toward the end of the talk. In the speaker notes, I also included a link to Heather's website, which is another wonderful resource. She's got all kinds of information there on native plants and planting for pollinators. So let me go through some of the insects that, if you start putting more and more native plants in your environment, that you'll start to see showing up. And I think these all have very interesting lives and add a lot of interest to our landscapes. One of the pollinators that we're probably all familiar with is the bumblebee. There are over a dozen species of bumblebees in New England. These are social bees, so they form a small colony, and they do a great deal of pollinating in our native environments. And they tend to come out very early in the season. I've seen some around my property over the last, starting to come out in the last couple weeks. One of the earliest bees to emerge that was a solitary bee. This is a cellophane bee that is easy to identify because it's got all this fur on its head and thorax. And again, this is one of the earliest bees that you'll find in the springtime. I found one about a month ago nectaring on some witch hazel that I have. Social bees tend to be aggressive if you disturb their nests. In contrast, solitary bees are very docile even around their nesting sites. The females tend to make a nest in the ground or in a cavity. They fill that cavity with their egg cells, seal it up, and then leave. So they, even if you're active around their nesting sites, they aren't going to bother you. Second group are the wasps. Similarly to the bees, they're solitary wasps and social wasps. The sand wasp, this little guy pictured here, is a solitary wasp. It is also, like the other wasps, a predatory garden beneficial. So although these guys have a bad reputation, especially yellow jackets, which if you've ever interacted with one of their nesting sites, you're probably aware of how aggressive they can be. But even the yellow jackets, when they're away from their nesting site, especially if they're feeding on something that they really enjoy, like this goldenrod, they're very docile and won't give your activity much of a consideration at all. So what these wasps tend to do is they find a prey item, which could be a caterpillar, could be a grasshopper. They sting that prey item, which paralyzes it, take it back to their nest. They tuck it away in the nest, lay their eggs on it, and the eggs hatch and the larvae grow up on that prey insect that's entombed in the nest of the wasp. So they have a very interesting life cycle as well, and there's a lot of wasps out there that different types that you can keep an eye out for. Okay, these are some beetles that are attracted to native plants in your garden. The beetles have a tendency to feed on the petals of flowers and on leaves on the plants. So sometimes you'll see chewing damage on the plants. That's a result of these guys. And they're not the most efficient pollinators because they don't tend to move around too much between plants, but they are very interesting, and they're one of the largest groups of insects. There's a huge amount of diversity, and as you bring more and more native plants in, you're going to see more and more of these. This is a soldier beetle, which is a wasp mimetic, but it's perfectly harmless to humans, and it's a very common beetle that you'll see in the garden. The blister beetle here, as its name would imply, is something that you don't want to handle, but it's very common, for example, on goldenrod. And then this guy is a wedge-shaped beetle, which seems to be doing a pretty good job in this picture of covering himself with pollen and spreading it around to the flowers that he's feeding on. Okay, the butterflies and moths are by far my favorite group of pollinators. To me, they provide the greatest amount of dynamic interest in your environment. And if you provide the right plants for them, they will show up, and they'll add a lot to your landscape. And I've pictured 3 of my favorites here. The one that gets my prize for the most beautiful butterfly and the cutest caterpillar is the spicebush swallowtail. And if you have spicebush in your landscape, which is very common around here, or if you plant spicebush, it won't take too long before you'll be able to find these on your spicebush. The caterpillars roll themselves up in the leaves, so they're very easy to find in leaf rolls. And they're one of the earliest butterflies to be active in terms of laying eggs. So you'll find them very early in the season, and they have 3 generations typically in this area. So they're present in one form or another pretty much throughout the whole season. You can also very easily bring these indoors and rear them inside if you want to, which is kind of fun to do. And here we have the Monarch Butterfly, which most people are familiar with the amazing migration story of these butterflies. There have been reports from Mexico this winter that the monarch population in the overwintering sites was down by over 70%. So there's a lot of concern with what's going on with the monarchs right now. And that freak snowstorm that they had down in Texas, there's a concern that may have wiped out some of the food sources that the monarchs need as they're migrating north. So there's a lot of concern about these right now. The best thing that you can do is try to put as many of the different types of milkweed into your landscape as you can. It's the only genus of plant that the monarchs will feed on and that supports their life cycle. The good news is there are many different types of milkweeds, and no matter what sort of conditions you have in your landscape, there are several types probably that you can grow for these butterflies. And the third butterfly that I'll mention is the tiger swallowtail, which is the largest of the butterflies that we have in Connecticut. These are don't mind having people around at all. You can go up to them, get very close to them. They're not at all shy. And one of their host plants is the native sweet bay magnolia, which is a beautiful semi-evergreen plant with very fragrant, beautiful flowers. So if you need to need a screening plant and want to have something that blooms throughout the season and has very fragrant flowers, I encourage you to think about the sweet bay magnolia. It's a great plant. There's a book called The Life Cycle of Butterflies by Judy Burris. This is a fantastic resource that is appropriate for young kids to adults. It's beautifully illustrated with pictures of about more than 20 very common species of butterflies, which are common in this area. And the illustrations are just fantastic. She captures every stage of the life cycle, from egg to the various instars of the larvae to the chrysalis and all the adult forms. And most importantly, she also provides a really good description of the nectaring plants that these different types of butterflies prefer, and also the host plants that the caterpillars will need to feed on if they're going to complete their life cycle. So it's a great resource. You can page through it, pretty much decide what sort of butterflies you want to add to your landscape, plant the host plants and the nectar plants that those butterflies prefer. And if you plant them, they will, in very short order, appear in your landscape. It's amazing how quickly they locate their food sources and make a home in your environment. And the last group of pollinators that I'll talk about are the flies. And again, unless you're planting native plants in your landscape, a lot of these aren't probably things that you would have found in a traditional planting. And most of these are also garden beneficials. The Surfeit Fly here, which is a harmless wasp mimetic, its larvae are a voracious feeder on aphids. So if you have aphid issues that crop up on your plants occasionally, this is one of the beneficial species that will help control that aphid population. This is an interesting bombiliid or bee fly. They have a long mouth part that can retrieve nectar from tubular flowers, and they actually are able to hover while they're feeding. And their fuzzy bodies collect a lot of pollen while they're doing that. So they're also one of the very efficient pollinator insects. This guy is a Techenid fly, another garden beneficial. They will lay their eggs on things like caterpillars and grasshoppers, and their larvae will then use those caterpillars and grasshoppers for a food source to grow on. And finally, this is a conopid or thick-headed fly. I think one of the most charismatic of any of the insects out there. They also have an interesting habit of finding their host insects in flight and laying an egg on them while they're in flight. So they're pretty acrobatic as well. So those are that's an overview of the wide diversity of pollinators that you can attract to your environment with native plants. But in the next few slides, I want to make a point that if you really want to bring pollinators into your environment, there's a few other things that you need to do besides just putting a few flowers, native flowers in your environment. And one of the considerations that we'll want to think about is providing a habitat that supports the entire life cycle of the insect. And as an example, this is a diagram of the life cycle of a bumblebee. Right now, the bumblebees are just beginning to emerge. Early spring, they come out of their overwintering sites. So they're going to be looking for pollen and nectar sources of the plants that are blooming very, very early in the season. So it's important to provide things like maple trees and willows and the spring ephemerals that can support those queens as they're coming out of their wintering sites. The queens, once they start foraging for nectar and pollen, shortly after that, they'll start to explore for nesting sites. Typically, they will occupy a hole under a rock or a log, or rodent holes are very attractive to them. And they'll occupy those sites and start building cells and laying eggs. Once that first brood hatches, the workers will then take over the foraging activities and taking care of the eggs. The queen will just focus on building cells and laying eggs. And then later in the summer, some of those worker bees will turn into gynes or immature queens that are about a third larger, about 3 times larger than the size of the worker bees. And very late in the season, around, it's usually the beginning of the fall, males will be produced, which will mate with the gynes, and then the mated females or the new queens will look for an overwintering site. And typically they will find a spot in the leaf litter. So if you want to give them a good habitat for overwintering, it's important to leave some of the leaves in place so that they have a place to find an overwintering spot. What I've said about bumblebees is true for the other social bees and solitary bees, as well as all the wasps as well. They have a very similar life cycle with a few small variations, but the important thing is to think about the habitat that they need to support their whole life cycle. Okay, these are a couple tables from Heather Holm's website, and what they show are native trees and shrubs that are attractive to pollinators on the left, as well as native perennial flowers for pollinators. And the thing to notice here is that if you look at the native perennials, there are very few things that are in bloom early in the season, especially in April. So if you want to support the pollinators early in the season, it's important to come over to the native trees and shrubs and make sure that you're providing things like the red maples and sugar maples, the willows, and also some of the early flowering shrubs like serviceberries. Those pollinators are going to emerge early in the spring, and they're going to be looking for those floral resources so that they can start their nests and start their breeding process. So the spring is a very important season to think about when you're designing your landscape, but also late in the season in the fall. So if you go to September and October, again, there's very few things that are in bloom during that time. So you want to make sure that you put things in your landscape like the Agastache. There are many varieties of goldenrod that provide late season nectar and pollen, as well as acting as a keystone host plant for a lot of different species. And also the sneezeweed, the Helenium, has a very long floral period throughout the late fall. So that's also a very, very good plant to consider in your landscape designs. And throughout the rest of the season, a chart like this can be very helpful in planning out a perpetual bloom throughout the summer so that there aren't any periods during the season when those pollinators are not going to have adequate pollen and nectar supply to rely on. Okay, and the next thing I'll talk about in terms of habitat is providing nesting sites and other resources for the bees. So, and one of the big things I like people to think about here, which is much different than the traditional landscape, is not to be too concerned with over tidiness. Some of the disorder and debris that we might find in a native landscape is, and that we try to remove in a traditional landscape situation, is habitat for a lot of different animals, including the native pollinators. So if you have any dead trees or snags standing on your property, and you can keep them standing safely, or any downed logs, as shown in this picture, the pileated woodpeckers have created some extensive roosting cavities here, and those will be occupied by other birds, bees, butterflies, all sorts of things will make use of those snags and downed logs. So keeping those in your landscape is a very, very important resource. Also, if you can create a brush pile in an out-of-the-way place on your property, that is an invaluable resource. Again, not only to pollinators, but our native amphibians and turtles, small and larger mammals as well. They'll all make use of the hiding places in a brush pile like that. And also leaving leaves and sticks in place is a great habitat resource for things like bumblebees and other insects as well. I talked about keystone species in the last talk, especially things like the oak trees that support hundreds and hundreds of different species of moths and butterflies. When those leaves rain down in the fall, if we rake them up and remove them from the property or mulch them up with our mowers, we're destroying vast numbers of pollinator larvae in that process. So leaving as many of the leaves in place and some of the other debris as well is a very important consideration. This is a diagram, again, from Heather Holm. And it's a little piece about maintenance in our pollinator gardens. And what she's promoting here is at the end of the season, rather than being very fastidious about our fall cleanup, she's advocating leaving the flower heads and stems on our plants, which can provide seeds for birds during the winter time. I think it also provides a lot of winter interest. A lot of these seed heads capture snowfall, and if you leave them up, they actually are very interesting in the landscape. But if you leave them up over the winter, early in the spring, if you do feel a need to cut them down, usually in March or April, it's a good time to do this. You can cut off the stems at a variety of heights, typically around 18 inches or so. Leave the cut seed heads in the garden if you can, and those will provide nesting sites for a lot of the cavity nesting bees. So they'll lay their eggs in the cavity. Those larvae will grow throughout the summer. Your perennials will come up, and all those stems that you left up for the pollinators will be hidden amongst the foliage. And then in the fall and winter, you'll have those seed heads forming again. The bees will continue to mature, and then early in the spring, those bees will emerge and then start looking for new nesting sites again. So this is a natural cycle that, if we're careful about it, we can promote the entire life cycle of those native bees. One thing you want to consider adding to your landscape, if you don't have it already, is a water source. All living things require a good source of water, and that can be as simple as having a bird bath in your landscape, or something like a bog and frog pond. No matter what you do, the important thing is to put some stones or sticks in those water sources so that the bees and butterflies and other pollinators have a safe place to land and drink, so they don't fall in and get trapped in the bird bath or the pond that you're providing. And lastly, I'd like to talk a little bit about the bee hotels that have become very popular lately. The thing I'd like to say about these are bigger is not better. The larger they get, the more likely the bees will have issues with predators and diseases that tend to get into these larger bee hotels when there's a lot of nesting sites in one close proximity. So a better strategy is to use smaller blocks of wood with fewer holes and scatter those over your landscape, so that the predators and disease organisms will have a much harder time finding those immature bees in the nests. And finally, I talked a bit about this in the last session, but there's a huge problem now with light pollution, and it's having a devastating effect across the board on insect populations. So if you do have a need to put lighting in your landscape, it's really important that you put that on a motion sensor or a timer, so that it's not on when it's not really being used, because there are a lot of insects that are attracted to that light, and it either interrupts their feeding or their mating, or makes them a target for predation. Okay, and the last thing that I'm going to talk about in terms of habitat is pesticides. And first thing that I'll say is that in a pollinator garden or native landscape, we are going to see some of our pollinators munching on the foliage of the things that we put in the landscape. And that's a good thing. It's an indication that the energy that is being from the sun that's being captured by those plants is being transferred through those larvae out into the rest of the ecosystem. All the higher organisms that are out there are pretty much reliant on those caterpillars and other larvae to harvest that energy from the sun and provide it as food to things like birds and other organisms. The next thing I will say in terms of pesticides is that if you do have a need to use a pesticide in your vegetable garden or in a flower garden situation, the very best thing is to avoid it if you can. But if you feel that you can't, there are some pesticides out there that are more targeted or less toxic than others. 3 of the less toxic ones are BT, spinosad, and neem oil. Again, even though the package may say that these are organic or safer, they are still going to have an effect on our pollinators, some off-target effects. So if you can avoid using these, that's the best situation. There is a class, though, of the systemic pesticides, for example, the neonicotinoids, which are taken up by all the plant tissues. These pesticides get into the nectar and pollen, and they cause a great deal of damage to pollinators. So I urge you to avoid using these in your landscape. They are counterproductive to pollinator gardening. Make sure also that when you're bringing in new plants from a garden center or nursery, that you've spoken with the personnel there to make sure you're not bringing plants that have been treated with systemic pesticides. Because the last thing you want to do in your pollinator garden is bring a death trap into the garden that is loaded with neonics. Finally, the last thing that I'll say here is that patience is definitely a virtue. If you're seeing a lot of aphid activity, for example, in one of your plants, very often, if we're just patient and wait a week or so even before there's much potential damage to that plant, there are lots of beneficials out there that are scouting for those pest insects and are very efficient at removing them for us once they find them. We just have to be a little patient and give them a chance to find those pests, and then they will tend to take care of them for us in a lot of cases. Okay, so this is my favorite part of the talk. It's focusing on the plants, and in the next few slides, I'm going to give 3 different scenarios, planting scenarios, and how you can think about plugging some native plants into those situations. And no matter what the landscape circumstances, there are some things you want to keep in mind as you're selecting your plants. First of all, you want to consider the light conditions, the moisture levels, and soil conditions, especially the pH. Make sure that the plants that you're selecting are compatible with the existing situations, so that you aren't constantly trying to water or amend the soil or doing other things that are unnecessary if you match up the plant to the location. The design I'm showing here is a minimal design. So I've selected a number of plants that will provide floral resources throughout the season, but this is a minimal design. You want to try and put as many different types of flowers into the garden as you can, because different pollinators have different preferences for the floral structure. Things like nectar pollen ratios, color. So the more diversity in flowers you have, the more diversity of pollinators you're going to attract. And you also want to make sure that you're putting about 5 to 7 plants of a certain species into that garden if you can. There are behaviors, especially in the social bees, things like Floral Constancy, which is a behavior that helps the bees be more efficient in their foraging, where they will focus on one flower type at a time, and they tend to start early in the day with their preferred flowers and move to the flowers that they don't like quite as much through the rest of the day. And by providing a mass of flowers for those bees, you allow them to forage more efficiently. So now looking at this specific landscape situation, this is a health strip between sidewalk and a road, very common in a suburban or urban situation. They often have full sun beating down on them throughout the day. But the great thing about native plants is that there are usually multiple native plants that can fit in almost any sort of niche. So even in this hot, dry, full sun situation, there are a wide variety of native plants that you can plug into someplace like this. One of my favorite grasses, which provides a lot of design structure here, is little blue stem. There are flowers like prairie smoke that bloom early in the season, provide some interest as well with the seed heads. This is Asclepius Tuberosa. It's often called butterfly weed. I prefer to call it butterfly flower because it's not really a weed. It's something that does very well in our pollinator gardens. And you can see it's covered with those spice bush swallowtails in this picture, but it provides host resources for monarchs and a wide variety of other butterflies and pollinators. There's also the solidagos and asters, which bloom very late in the season. And you can get some really nice color combinations and things blooming very late into the season if you plan for them accordingly. Okay, so the next scenario that I'll talk about is a woodland situation. The light conditions here, very different, dappled sun, dappled shade. If you have a woodland path or even a walkway next to a garden or road, maybe a shady patio situation, there's a lot of different plants that you can can put into that sort of situation that'll do very well. One of my favorite grasses for a lower light situation is Pennsylvania sedge. There's also northern sea oats, which is very attractive, provides a lot of motion in the environment, great nesting sites as well. And then all different kinds of flowers that do very well in a low light situation. Columbine, the wild blue phlox, our native senna, big leafed asters, wood asters, and then the goldenrods as well. This is a zigzag goldenrod that does very well in low light conditions. And again, it's one of our keystone plants. So that's always something good to put into your designs. And finally, if you have the space, or you can design even a smaller space to provide a forest edge meadow type of environment. This is, from a biodiversity standpoint, the most ecologically productive situation that you can create. And what you want to look to do here is put in large keystone species, like the white oaks and the red maples, things like chokecherry and willows for shrubs. These will provide a lot of, again, early season floral resources. And then there are innumerable native plants that you can think about putting into a meadow situation. The milkweed, the black-eyed Susans, bonesets, two of my favorite native grasses for this situation. This is a prairie dropseed, which has a very beautiful flowing architecture. Doesn't get that tall, maybe a foot or two if it's doing very well. And then the big blue stem, which gets quite tall, but it provides a lot of four-season interest and great habitat as well. And then for midsummer, things like the monardas and the agastache are very important. And then again, the goldenrods and asters for late in the season. If you can do something like this, it's a wonderful four-season interest and supports the life cycle of many, many, many different pollinators and other organisms. Okay, I'd like to end by encouraging you to take a day trip up to Garden in the Woods in Framingham, Mass. It's the home of the Native Plant Trust, which used to be called the New England Wildflower Society. They changed their name a couple years ago. But they have wonderful demonstration habitats. Everything from ponds and streams to open meadows, deep forest, every sort of ecological niche that you could possibly imagine, with the exception of high mountain alpine perhaps, but pretty much everything else is covered in this landscape. And it's a wonderful inspiration. They put a lot of thought into the designs that they do in the different groupings of plants. And it's easy to spend hours just wandering around the trails there and taking pictures and getting ideas for different plant combinations and figuring out what plants are going to do best in a certain location. I just got an email from them a couple days ago. They are open to the public again now after being closed for an entire year. They are requiring registration in advance though online, so don't just drive up there. Make sure you get a reservation and a time slot first before you go. But aside from the wonderful gardens and landscapes, they have a really nice garden shop and bookstore, and also a very extensive native plant nursery there as well, where you can look for a lot of different plants that are hard to find in some of the local garden centers. Okay, and that pretty much concludes my talk for tonight. Thank you very much for attending. I hope I've given you a number of useful tips that you can use in constructing your own pollinator garden. I encourage every one of you to try and think about how you can put these plants into your landscape at scale, whether that's in a large landscape environment or, as I said, putting in containers on a patio or a balcony. Every bit that we can do is a big contribution. I'll also remind you that on the Plantscapes homepage at the bottom, there is a link to feedback. I'm always appreciative of anything you can, any comments you have about these presentations, or if you have any questions that aren't covered in the Q&A, feel free to put those into the feedback form, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can with those on those questions. And with that, I'll turn it back to Eric, and I'll be happy to take any questions you might have.